We need to talk.
137. It would be safe to say in the investment world, change isn't coming. It's already here.
The world has been galvanized into action. What can we do to contribute to a more equitable society?
The future belongs to those who adapt, those who identify shortcomings and unlock value.
A quantum leap was necessary.
I think you understate the situation. It isn't necessary. It's essential if we're to build any kind of a future.
We have to ask ourselves, what can we do to invest in the right places, for the right reasons? Not because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the only thing to do.
The warmest welcome to Critical Conversations, brought to you by Sanlam Investments. My name is Lerato Mbele, and as you know by now, these are a series of dialogues that are aimed at focusing our minds on the issues of the day: people, prosperity, and the planet. Now, today we're talking about a really important issue. It is bringing the millennials into the conversation. Millennials and Generation Z. Generally speaking, these are the young consumers of the modern day. They are generally under the age of 40, but more specifically, they are under the age of 25. And we want to talk to them and bring them into the conversation as we discuss climate for social's sake. Now, what do we know about this category of consumers, Millen-Z? Research shows that they're very passionate about one particular thing, transparency. They want to know everything from the farm to the fork, what inputs are used, what the production process is, how goods are transported to the market and how many gas emissions there are. They want to know on the assembly line, what is the parity between men and women. They want to know what people are paid. And those companies that are able to tap into the sentiment of Millen-Z, into the priorities of Millen-Z, have actually seen their earnings grow. They've also seen an improvement in their brand value and equity. Millen-Z want a world of accountability. It's no longer business as usual. So today we are giving Millen-Z a platform to share with us their insights, their passions, their empathy around an important issue, climate change, for social sake. Now, we also encourage you to participate in the conversation. You can do that by using the hashtag Critical Conversations, and make sure that when you participate on the social media spaces, you tag at Sanlam Investments, hashtag Critical Conversations, tag Sanlam Investments, and remind them the conversation, Millen-Z, climate for social sake. Without further ado, let me introduce to you our wonderful panelists. I'm happy to say it is an all-female, all-South African Black Girl Magic panel. That's the point you were supposed to go, whoop, whoop. All right, so first up is Lulega Dlamini. She's a PhD candidate whose research has focused on climate and crop modeling as it pertains to small-scale farmers. We also have Morategi Khale, who is a PhD researcher whose discipline is human geography, and her particular area of focus is the unemployment of graduates in South Africa. We're also joined by Akhona Tlotieni, who is a well-voiced youth advocate, and we have Ayake Melitafa, who is a climate justice activist, and she's actually the public representative with the African Climate Alliance. I know that we were scheduled to have Teboho Makhabane. She's an ESG impact and implementation specialist at Sanlam Investments. However, due to unforeseen circumstances, a family emergency, she's not able to be with us today. But Teboho assures us that in future she'd really like to participate in these critical conversations and share all of what she's learned in the ESG space and investment community. Remember, we want to hear from you. We need to hear from you. We'd like you to pose your questions and your comments on the Q&A functionality of the platform. That's where you raise your questions, write your comments. I will ask them on your behalf. And also, we're going to conduct a few polls just to gauge your interest in a particular subject matter. So make sure you have fingers at the ready and you're able to participate in the polls so that we have more engagement. Without further ado, Millen-Z, let's get talking. The warmest welcome to Critical Conversations. Let's start off with you just very quickly. The single most important reason, Lulega, that influenced you to be an activist?
I think for me, it was sugarcane. I love sugarcane. I'm from KZN. So over the years, it was just the fact that the stems were getting shorter, the sweetness was not there. We also have amananje at the backyard. But now the flowering time, when you harvest, kept on changing. And that somehow got me intrigued into thinking about climate and how that affects the things that we see on our daily basis.
Ayaka?
For me, pain, disappointment, and frustration is what I can say, because my mom is a small-scale farmer. And when the day zero water crisis was in the Western Cape, it really affected her. And the thing is, since she was a little bit out of Cape Town, we didn't see what was happening to the farm. So when we went there in June and we just saw how devastating it was, it just absolutely broke my heart. And the fact that my mom was trying not to worry us and trying to be a resilient, strong Black woman she is, it really just made me ask questions that, why is this happening? And I knew from that point that I had to do something about it.
Akhona?
For me, it's two phases. The first part was I was raised by my grandmother, Eastern Cape, Zimbabwe, and she used to every day go out into the garden and farm for herself. But I think distinctly like Ayaka, it was the day zero droughts in the Western Cape, where I was part of a residence and my portfolio was the sustainability portfolio, and I had to implement water policies and water practices in the residence. Then I saw the scale of it in our small community.
Right. Morategi, coming to us via video link, what prompted you to be an activist?
For me, it was about recognizing the fact that human suffering, and especially suffering that's caused by inequality and poverty and made worse by climate change, is not inevitable. We live in a really abundant economy, and there's no reason for poverty and inequality. So we can and should change kind of the social, political, and economic systems that we've been living under.
Murateg, I'll just stay with you very quickly. Here we are talking to you as a category of young people, Millen-Z, millennials and Generation Z. But we've often been cautioned not to pigeonhole young people. What do you make of the category millennial or Gen Z?
I think on the one hand, it is correct that you can't kind of pigeonhole a very large group of people because young people are so different and have different perspectives. But on the other hand, I think that generational groups can be a useful starting point for conversations like this because people's experiences are mediated by geography, culture, economy, society, etc. Right. And so people who live in a particular set of circumstances are able to have shared experiences that inform their perspectives. However, I do think it's important to recognize as well that these categories of millennial, Gen Z, baby boomer, etc., are terms that we get from countries like the United States that may not apply to contexts like South Africa. So in my own research, personally, I always prefer to maybe talk about kind of a post-apartheid generation, which I think speaks more accurately to what we deal with in South Africa.
And Nakon, I don't want to belabor this issue of definitions, but those who are critical of the definitions also say that the post-apartheid generation, young people, tend to be a bit fatalistic. You are passionate, but you're borderline doomsday theorists.
I think for us, it's very realistic. It's not a doomsday ideological idea, but it's practical. It's our destiny and our daily lives. So I think once you see poverty, once you see climate crises in your lifestyle and your daily life, then it won't be a doomsday ideal, but it's actually your daily lifestyle where you feel the threats, where you feel the poverty and the pain, and you see the people around you suffering. So I think it is important to not just see young people as angry people who just want to theoretically, voice their opinions, but to see them as people with lived experiences, and they do deserve to have an opinion.
And those experiences are valid. Okay, let's get talking. The climate crisis events around the world. We are seeing rising temperatures, Lulega. We are seeing more droughts, flooding. I have a story of my own. But is it just a cycle of nature, or is it catastrophe, Armageddon?
It is. I think it's important to acknowledge that climate does change. So we can always say last year it was hotter or warmer or it was drier compared to this year. So that the climate does vary over the years. However, when we look at long-term climate, we can clearly see that over time, over decades and decades, our temperatures are actually increasing. You can clearly see that the moment we started to introduce the industry, fossil fuels, transportations, and all of that, you can clearly see that there is a link between how the temperatures are increasing, how the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is actually increasing, and that's why we have termed this as being anthropogenic climate change.
It's what?
Anthropogenic.
That's a big word. Okay, tell us, what does it mean?
That simply means it's human-induced. It's our activities that have led to a point whereby the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is this high, and that correlates very well with the rising temperatures.
So those who are now putting this issue front and center, and actually it's taking place at a high level now. It's country level, presidential level, COP, and the various agreements. There's two streams of thought. There's the mitigation, and there's the adaptation. The mitigation is prevent climate incidents in the future. Adaptation is cope with them. What is the best way to go about it?
It's both. We need to mitigate. Again, we're going to go back to the fact that we have climate variability. This changes every year. So what do I do now to cope now? But also at the same time, we have a long-term thing, which means based on our projections, for example, South Africa is projected to get drier and warmer. So what do we do to adapt to that situation? Even though long-term we'll have drier and warmer conditions, but what if in 2021 or 2025 we have sudden flooding? What does a smallholder farmer then do, which is where mitigation comes in? So you have long-term adaptation, but you also have small mitigation strategies that can help you with year-to-year changes in climate.
Ayaka, what do you think the approach ought to be? Because people have to cope now, but thinking long term, at a policy level, the interventions that are needed.
What is becoming very clear is that young people are getting drowned out of the conversation of climate change, firstly. And it's so rare because it's so weird because we're the ones that are going to be suffering the most from climate change. So in terms of mitigation and adaptation, the IRP just introduced saying the integrated resource plan, if I'm like putting a little bit of context, just stated that they're trying to introduce more coal coming in the years. And as young people, that's a direct betrayal to us in South Africa, as it tells us, we know you're suffering, we see that you're suffering, but we're still not going to do anything about it, and we'll still put profit above you. So it's a huge betrayal in our faces, and it's not enough for us to just say, okay, let's adapt to it. We have to mitigate it now, but even further than that, we have to change our education systems. As young people, what we're taught in schools is not valuable to the 21st century society. I mean, we need to go into spaces where we know that we're going to thrive, and those are spaces of climate change, environmentalism, what you're doing, and like young people don't see that because still what we're learning in schools is that, no, just go to school, be a teacher, be a nurse, and those are things that aren't really working in society because we have graduates that don't have jobs.
I just want to challenge that a little bit, this term of betrayal, because South Africa is still going to go the fossil fuel route. Do you appreciate that the leaders of the country are juggling many balls, social priorities? So coal may be a pollutant, but the country has it in abundance, and it's easier to produce electricity. And you've got a country where historically people haven't had energy, people haven't had jobs. And so they look for low-hanging fruits to address some of those problems. How to produce electricity, how to create jobs, whilst at the same time bringing in independent power producers into the grid. It's almost like a two parallel stream that they've got to, because the reality is now you need electricity today, you need jobs today, and then long term you need to go green.
No, I definitely agree, and I have to appreciate the policies that South Africa has in place. I mean, I'm part of the Presidential Climate Commission, which is basically an advisory body.
Shine. Shine.
That's basically an advisory body that's going to try to build a framework to lead South Africa into a net zero path by 2050. So I applaud that, and the fact that I'm on that commission says that they are ready to involve us in the conversation. But practically speaking, yes, we do have an abundance on coal, and we do have to realize that in South Africa, we're a young, independent country. So like we can't really put ourselves at the same pace as global north countries, but then we still have to hold that accountability that we need to lead by example. It doesn't matter that, okay, we're facing those triple threat, we're facing poverty, we're facing inequality, we're facing those things, but then we can use the opportunity of climate change to like produce more jobs. We can use this opportunity to be a leader in the global south, to make sure that we move away from fossil fuels and we find renewable energy as a source to make sure that our economy grows into a green economy, because we have abundance of sunlight, we have air, we have good resources.
And good wind.
Good wind, exactly. So we can't really have excuses and say, no, we still need to rely on coal, because then we're directly betraying the young people, we're betraying like the future generation, and we can't avoid the hard decisions making now because we say, it's too hard, or we're going to lose money.
I want to bring Murategi into this conversation. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to add to the conversation about mitigation and adaptation. So I think, we do need to be mitigating, and there's so much research that shows that renewable energies is actually becoming quite big now, and scholars have made arguments that South Africa is in actually quite a good position to be kind of a world leader in renewable energy. So in 2020, there were kind of 300 billion total investments in new renewable energies, which is about kind of double what's invested in fossil fuels and nuclear combined. And then on the point of adaptation, I wanted to bring out kind of the tensions that are involved, particularly for developing countries on adaptation. So we know that developing countries are quite focused on adaptation because we'll be feeling the impacts of climate change more disproportionately than the global north, even though they're historically more responsible for that. So in 2021, there was a study that was actually able to quantify that number. And they say that the result of that 92% of the emissions are historically been caused by rich countries in the global north. And so that raises questions about who's responsible for fixing this and how they pay and financing that adaptation as well.
Muratak, I want to stay with you because even Ayake refers to the global north and the global south, and then you've also added the terminology rich versus developing nations. Give us a sense in terms of this climate justice agenda. Who's dominating it? Because it almost feels as though, you know, you've lived climate change from your youth, but it's on the agenda today because richer countries say it's on the agenda. And the question is, why? Why now?
So I think because of the position that we find ourselves in, kind of developing countries or countries in the global south have had to champion the issue of climate justice and just transitions, because that historically developed countries have been the major causes of climate change. And so when we talk about climate justice and just transitions, it's about realizing that all these things that are happening are more than about the environment, but that you also have to take into account history, equality, human rights, and social and historical responsibility as well. So, I mean, I hope that more countries are able to come on to kind of push more strongly for climate justice. And I think they've made indications about pledging more money for climate adaptation in developing countries. So what I think we need is for that to become a more concrete agreement rather than a signal for, wanting to do something.
People must put their money where their mouths are.
Yes.
Lulega, you've got something to say.
I just wanted to add in terms of context. When we look at the IPCC, the last report that was sent out last year, fortunately I was able to be part of the report that was based on Africa and seeing how climate change has affected Africa and the projections that are thereof coming into the future. So if we look at the global north, for example, and compare it to Southern Africa as a region, we can clearly see the research is showing that the temperatures will double compared to what will happen in the global north. So we're looking at something like 2 to 4 degrees warmer than what was in 1981. So that means everything else that is happening here will be much more exacerbated by these changes.
So Africa more adversely impacted. I want to go back to this idea of Millen-Z. Millennials and Generation Z. There is a study that was conducted by EY, which is a leading auditing firm internationally, and this was post the Paris Agreement, that groundbreaking Paris Agreement of 2015. And when countries couldn't live up to the promises and the pledges, there was that sense of betrayal that you referred to, Ayake. And in the United States, here are the stats. Young people engage climate issues at a rate of 37% daily, online, talking, commenting, researching, 37% daily. And those who are engaged on the issue, 80%, so the majority of young people who are addressing, talking, interested in climate change, 80% of those people feel emotionally affected by slow action to the point of recording depression and anxiety when they think about climate change. I recognize it's an emotive issue. It's an emotional one. Is this how young South Africans feel?
Yeah, that's the reality. I mean, after I found out about climate change, after doing research, when I saw the drought from my mom, I got in such a climate anxious space because I just got into the internet and they told me global warming is real, the climate is in disaster, there's fire, everything was happening so fast. And I was like, how did I not know about this if I'm already living in it? So there was that sense of, obviously, if governments know this information, if scientists have already approved it and they're not doing anything about it, how am I going to make a change? So it does put you in a sense of place of hopelessness, feeling betrayed, feeling like what's the use of even going to school because it's not going to do anything if the world is going to go down.
The world's ending, yeah.
The world's ending. I was going to use a bad word. So
feel free.
So definitely there was that sense of anxiety, that sense of depression, because we're getting told that this is the projection or the path that we're on, yet we see our global leaders, people that we trust with our lives, not doing as much as they need to do. So that is actually something that's very echoed in the South African society.
Are young South Africans as engaged as the statistics we see in America?
I think In South Africa, we need to define it more in our context. So calling it climate change is a technical term, it's a scientific term. Other people understand it in a more social and realistic sense. So for example, sustainability, there's a terminology for sustainability, then there's people practicing sustainability. So people who are doing farming, who are doing renewable energy in their own homes, who have the batteries. People understand the concept, but sometimes people don't know the terminology. So I think across the board in Africa, specifically in South Africa, there's a lot more young people who are practicing sustainability and climate activism in the terms of droughts, farming, agriculture, but people don't use the terminology, and now we think people are climate ignorant or oblivious. And I think in the context of South Africa as well is the aspect of like our lived experiences. So, for example, I'll make two examples with the flash floods which happened in Tshwane and the other ones in the Eastern Cape in the last 2 months. People could contextualize what they were feeling and could contextualize what was happening. And they knew that the infrastructure was not serviced, so the drains couldn't process the water. And they knew that their homes were built on a dry dam. But people didn't know the scientific terminology to express that this is a climate crisis. But they knew that we are not safe and we feel like as if we are displaced right now. And that's where the climate anxiety and existential crisis comes from, is that we are feeling these crises, we are seeing these crises, but unfortunately, because a lot of people are not aware of the terminology and the jargon, they're excluded from the conversation.
There's so many things you've said there, and I think it's a great segue into our next topic, really, which is, or something, which is how South Africa is impacted. Because before, as you're saying, we may have thought these were phenomenon in rural areas affecting the farms. It's now in the cities. And it's not just a changing environment. It's also a reflection on the poor infrastructure. You talk about the flooding in Pretoria. Well, do you know I've just written off a car because my car got caught up in a massive storm, and the drainage was bad, and it got into the engine, and it's over. So it's not just that it rained, it's that the infrastructure can't cope. And that's now something uniquely South African. And I think that is a good way to start introducing the idea of how, in particular, this country and this economy is going to shape up going forward. But just before we do that, I would like to invite you, our delegates and our participants, to please add your voice to this poll. And my question to you is, do children in South Africa suffer more from climate events? Do children in South Africa suffer more? What do you think? All right, we're waiting for the poll results to come through, but I can also see that there are many questions that are coming in from our participants as well. The Earth is changing, so it's not just a climate change issue, is what they have to say. All right, whilst we wait for those polls to come through, I'm going to hand over to Murategi. Murategi, if you could do us the grace of telling us a little bit about what you believe the future for South Africa looks like. Do children in South Africa suffer more from climate events? The view is, the 80% view is yes. So, what is the future like for South African children, Murategi?
Oh, that's a tough question to answer. And I mean, of course, so much of it depends on what we're able to do right now. So, I mean, we're talking about climate for social sake, and a big part of that is that unemployment and joblessness is such a crucial issue to it, and we have to think about the future of jobs. So in one respect, people talk about the future of jobs in terms of tech and how we're evolving, and I think that's okay, but I think there's another sense in which we have to think about the future of work, and that's in the reality of our economy. So South Africa has been experiencing structural unemployment since before democracy, years of jobless growth. And so what does that mean for us going forward, and whether we need to rethink the types of interventions that are necessary? So if we're linking it back to climate change, there are going to be a lot of people in the coal industry who are going to be without jobs. And so how do we retrain them? Where do we kind of find opportunities for them in the economy going forward?
Let's talk about one particularly aggravating South African issue: electricity supply, energy supply, the Eskom issue. Now, it was alluded to earlier on when Ayake made her point, but the issue is South Africa has an integrated resource plan. Integrated means different elements incorporated in the strategy. Coal may be center, but ultimately it will be phased out. And now you're seeing interesting things happening, like big producers, mining companies, etc., being allowed to generate and then sell back to Eskom and put it into the grid. So there are wind farms, there's a solar strategy, and now we're seeing big companies that are able to produce a certain cap and put it back. What do you make of the approaches to energy generation and this integrated program?
So I think it's a really important one because, like I said earlier, the fact of renewable energy is not a whether we're going to do it, it's just a how we're going to do it. And so the phasing out, I think, is something that has to be managed very, very carefully because in Mpumalanga alone, the coal industry employs about 82,000 people. And so if we talk about kind of just transitions, then we have to make sure that those people in their communities are well looked after, even after we've transitioned outside of coal. But I think, of course, this is going to be a very long process. I think they've estimated that they want to do this over 20 years. And economists have also estimated that even that transition will cost about 6 billion rand to achieve and get right if we take all of these factors into account.
Unemployment is a real sticking one, Morategi, almost 40%. And within that context, the largest proportion of people who are unemployed are young people, are Gen Zs and millennials. What needs to happen for this South African economy to absorb them? Some say, you can take this action, you can take that action, graduate placement programs. Others are just saying it's a full overhaul.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the conversation, the dominant conversation is around job creation. But like I said, I think that's very difficult because we have seen South Africa grow and jobs not be created. So I think that signals to a bigger problem in the kind of economy and the way that it's structured that might not be very helpful for us going forward. And I also think that the conversation around job creation obscures the extent to which people can have jobs and still be poor. So there's about over half of the people in South Africa who are working but live below the minimum, the poverty line, and they're called the working poor. And the poverty line is even quite low. So I suspect that if we move it higher, there'll be even more people who are classed in the working poor. So for me, I think social protection will play a really big role. So I think that it would be interesting to have a conversation around, and this is already happening because of the pandemic, basic income or alternatively job guarantees.
Yeah, and I think it will be interesting to watch the finance minister's speech this week. He's already signaled that he won't be introducing a minimum wage, but he says that process is underway. Perhaps 2-3 years from now, that's where we're going. So we'll see what happens there. Sorry?
We'll see.
You have no confidence in South Africa's leaders?
I did not say that.
You just said we will see.
I just said we will see.
Okay, I want us to bring out a few issues that are coming up by way of the South African context. So if we go back to some research, a lot of this research concerning the society, it's American-based. But what we're seeing in enrollment rates at universities in the north is increasingly young people are choosing to study environmental sciences, human geography, issues around climate law, and climate financing. Much more than we see young people opting to get into the traditional fields, medicine, law, accounting. I don't know what it looks like in the South African context, but if there is that shift in terms of research and training, how can corporate South Africa come to the party here?
Just to firstly start there, if we look at our universities, for example, it's still very small. If you look at climate, environmental, it's still pro-white, pro-male-dominated field. So in terms of comparing that to South Africa, we're just scraping the surface. I think socially, we still have, we've been told constantly that you have to be a doctor, an engineer, and things like that. So when it comes to education and exposing us to different working type of things, it's very completely different. Take my example. I didn't know anything about environmental sciences. I just loved sugarcane. Someone said, you can do something in an environment. It was my sixth choice, and I ended up going through that route and enjoying it. However, when I got to varsity, there are things like geology, there are things like human geography, there are things like a whole spectrum that you can choose and deal with. But when you go to lower level, there is no education regarding that. We don't know anything.
Lower
about
level
those.
is at school, kind of career training.
Yes. There's nothing that's actually looking at having expos that are concentrated at educating us about the environment and things like that. Then there's also now the working class. We have a lot of graduates, some of my peers that I studied with, that don't have jobs. But we're saying environment and climate change issues are critical at the moment. So is the system, the universities, talking to the corporate and ensuring that we have these skills, we need them, we have to start doing and producing solutions. But do we have the workforce to then employ these people and ensuring that they're not just ticking boxes in terms of being environmentally cautious and things like that, but are they really having people that are skilled in that sector and applying different solutions so that they are held accountable?
Is South Africa thinking in a transformative way about its economy and its system?
I think South Africa tends to think in silos. We tend to separate our issues and we tend to separate our priorities. And I think in order to think in the direction of transformation, we need to start bringing people together. Like Lulama mentioned, I also started in the social sciences and I was very passionate about human rights and social justice. And then when I started realizing that with a lot of social issues comes an environmental challenge, an element, then in my postgrad, then I decided to start moving towards the environmental sciences. So I think if we start incorporating the different fields and the different sectors, then we will be able to transform and transition into a more kind of integrated and more kind of collaborative sector. Because I think once we start looking at these elements and interventions at a more kind of like integrated element, and we start looking at them, as you mentioned, in more basic education and higher education, and also the graduate exits, then we start also intervening at more reachable levels for everyone and not just one aspect. So I think the term transformation is loosely used in South Africa. We tend to see it as a post-apartheid, just putting black people in positions, but you still, as you mentioned, like we have a lot of data which shows that it's still predominantly male and white. And I think we need to start looking at also the data and the people in the positions rather than the BEE kind of policies we put in the workplaces.
And BEE could include social justice and social transform. Okay, Ayake, again, going back to this issue of what are the priorities that must be balanced. So when we think of a future prosperity, planet and people, I think the concern is valid because the data tells us it's not looking good. But the reality of today, February 2022, unemployment is a real issue. Crime is a real issue. An economy that's not growing above 1.7%, 2%, it's a real issue. The jobless growth Murategi referred to. A rand stable at the moment, but still relatively weak compared to the dollar, and making it cheap and affordable to do business in South Africa. Energy supply, those are the here and nows. And here is a society grappling with these real issues, and then we want to throw climate into the mix.
It's a huge, huge thing, and it's a huge task we tasked with these young people. It's seeming that society is looking for the answers from us, and it's so weird because we're supposed to just be kids. We're supposed to be living. We're supposed to be able to trust our leadership. But now what we're seeing is we don't have leaders. We don't have elders anymore, people that care about the interest of young people. We have people solely focused on maximizing profit. And those are discussions that we have to have. We keep putting bandages on bullet wounds right now and saying, no, we have to deal with the here and the now. But the reality is we have to start making those uncomfortable conversations of the capitalist society. We have to start the uncomfortable conversations of climate reparations. And that's how we actually be able to fight the climate crisis in time. Because now it's just a subject, no, that's too hard. We're not going to speak about that. We're just going to do on something we can do now. And that's really not helping
but aren't the issues of now important?
They are, but the way that we can make sure that they're addressed is by addressing the underlying root issues, because now it's not going to help anything. It's like, for example, if we address poverty and if we address gender-based violence, that's not going to get rid of the climate crisis. So we have to solve all of these things
at the same time.
At the same time.
In tandem.
Yes, definitely. We can't be working in silos, as you said. We have to find synergies. And it's very important that we start those conversations right now, because the more we avoid them, the more that little change is being happening.
And when you use the term a bandage on a bullet wound, is that a reference to South Africa in particular?
It is. It is, definitely. And I use that reference because I feel like people will understand the urgency. Of South Africa currently, the youth unemployment rate for people between 15 and 25 is about 64%. That's almost 2/3 of the population, and predominantly those are black people. The black kids are getting left out of the conversation, and we're hurting, and we're traumatized, and people are still continuing to put profit over people. We need to change that narrative, and as young people, we really are growing tired. We are getting tired of giving people chances. For example, a couple of years back, I was part of the Rights of the Child petition, where we took the 5 most emitting countries to court for not upholding the Convention of the Rights of the Child that states that you have to protect the child and you have to make sure that their needs are met. And by them not addressing climate change or the climate crisis, it means they're directly telling us in our face, we see you hurting, but we don't care.
I just want to raise some questions, quick answers, please. Bukasa Kalala says, good day. There are some age-related to climate change, or in other words, eras in human history that are related to climate change. The Ice Age, the Stone Age, the Water Age. What period do you think we're in?
Anthropogenic climate change. The
Human
one that
induced.
is human-induced.
Lerato, can I just add to that? I think I would like to agree, but also disagree. So we are in the age where it's anthropogenic and it's human-induced, but I think we have the opportunity to be in the sustainability epoch. So we can transition into the sustainability epoch where we try and reintegrate processes. We still kind of have time, but I do agree with you that we are the causes. Since the 19th century, we have been through industrial revolution causing it, but we still have the opportunity to transition as well.
In terms of ages and epochs, Clive Kemp says, in 1933, in Libya, the world recorded a temperature at 57.8 degrees Celsius. 57. Haibo. Does that mean global warming started before 1922?
Like I said initially, the climate does change naturally, so you will have events that are high at a certain point. So that could have been just one event that happened
A
then.
phenomenon.
Yeah, phenomenon. But if we look at climate change, we're looking at long term. So things over the period of 10, 20, 30 years. And that's why also when we talk about projections, we're looking at a long term. What will happen in 20, 30 years' time?
What, in your young lived experience and also the technical knowledge you've acquired, what do you believe is the short-term challenge, and what are the wins in order to overcome this from a climate perspective?
Short-term challenges, I'd say it's farming. Food insecurity is very much increasing, and we have an abundance of female small-scale farmers in Africa, and they're getting left out of the conversation. They're just suffering and being forced to be resilient. So we need to start bringing them into the conversation, because we have initiatives. They've been in Africa for years and years and years. It's not about reinventing the wheel. We just have to go back. We are lembo, if I can put it that way.
And the wins? What are the things we can do now?
Things that we can practically do now is raise awareness. It always starts with awareness. It always starts with education. We need to go to communities that are getting affected and allowing people to voice their experiences and linking that to climate change. We need governments to go down from their policy stands and go down to the people on the ground and really hear what they are struggling with, because there's always that disconnect. The people in policy are not communicating to communities that are being affected.
Okay, no more ivory towers. That was a question from Rafiq Taylor. And this question to you, Murategi from Petunia Mpoza, says, how do we reconcile development, so economic, social development, and global warming, or the challenges posed by climate change? How do we reconcile development, global warming, the challenges, with awareness and education, particularly in both urban and rural settings? Because how these two communities experience it will be different.
Yeah, so I think I'll start with something that I wanted to say in regards to the previous, one of the previous questions that was posed is about whether we're living in an ice age or etc. But I think as much as I kind of agree with Luleka that we live in kind of an anthropogenic age and humans are the cause of climate change. But I also don't think that kind of humans are so much the cause of the ecological breakdown. But I think that it's because we live in an economic system that's organized around kind of protecting the interests of powerful states, corporations, and rich individuals. And so maybe what we need to focus on is the fact that we're living in a capitalist era, and maybe we need to start thinking about a post-capitalist era and what that looks like for well-being. And I think thinking about transformation in that sense makes it easier for us to be able to think about development, economic development, well-being, climate change, all in the same breath, because then we're centering human needs and well-being rather than centering kind of capital accumulation and elite interests. And on the question of rural and urban areas, I think that's a very important one because, and a lot of the time I've seen this in my own research where urban young people especially are able to get kind of resources that aid in their development, and certainly not as much as they should. But I think rural young people are even worse off. And that's something to take to kind of better, we need to do better at.
Yeah, so really channeling the focus towards those who are on the front lines, and those are people in the rural areas. We'll continue with this conversation. I do want to gauge your sentiments as our delegates here at the Critical Conversations Season 2, February 2022, Millen-Z, Climate for Social Sake. Which of the following is true about South Africa's climate issues? It's a poll. Fingers to the ready. Let's vote now. Which of the following is true about South Africa's climate issues? This is great engagement coming through. So many people have questions and have comments, and we will continue to talk about a range of issues. I'd like to introduce questions of innovation, funding, and game-changing solutions in a second, but let's just see what the poll tells us. Which of the following is true? By 2040, residents of Khayelitsha will need to queue, for water. 5% believe it's true. By 2060 in Limpopo, it will be too hot to work outdoors. 6% believe that's true. Since 1980, there have been 90 weather-related disasters recorded. 11% say that's true. And 73% of you say all of the above is true. People will be queuing for water. It will be too hot to work outdoors. And yeah, there have been more than 90 weather-related events. That's a huge indictment on human activity, human behavior, and as we've heard, corporate behavior when there's too much production. At this juncture, I think it's great for us to get a message from our hosts, Sanlam Investments, because all of this that we're discussing speaks to how we put away money, save for the future, prepare for the future, and the view here is you can do it confidently.
Confidence takes the lead. It says enough is enough. Confidence looks in the mirror and has the courage to say, we can do better, think bigger, look further, and find smart ways to invest in a more sustainable future. So confidence invests in people. It innovates and pushes boundaries. Confidence works hard and harder still to find investment solutions that make a meaningful difference to communities, our planet, and to our future. Confidence has integrity and vision. Confidence looks beyond wealth creation and finds a greater purpose. Confidence inspires a nation to invest in a future for all, a world where we can all flourish, while building a sustainable tomorrow. Because confidence knows a sustainable future is the best long-term investment we can make.
Do it with confidence, do it conscientiously, do it for the future. That future are made up of Millen-Z, the millennials, under 40s, Generation Z, under 25s, the youth of the future, the consumers of the future, the workers of the future, they care, they're passionate because they can literally see that trajectory, that timeline. And because of Sanlam Investments, we've given them a platform to air out their grievances, their views, and share with us their fantastic and knowledgeable insights. It's been a fantastic conversation with you so far. Let's talk about game-changing solutions because, you know, in a situation like this, the tendencies for us to rehash the problems. And yes, we need to talk about them because some we haven't heard about them before. The shortened stems of the sugarcane. It's a real issue. Yep. If you work in KwaZulu-Natal and you're living on those farms. But how do we fix it? And what I want to know from you, Akona Kocheni, will the solutions be financial? Will they be tech-inspired? Or will they involve policy?
I think we need all three. I think people tend to focus on the more technological solutions, which are more kind of building products and funding scientific labs. But I think we need to prioritize the structural ones, such as the policies. We need to think of innovative and creative ideas, which include young people. Young people are very much marginalized in those spaces. We see that in our departments, there's not many young black women, such as ourselves, who are in the rooms to discuss the solutions which are needed. And then I think also we need to also inspire people who are entrepreneurs. So I think in our modern era now, we've encouraged young people to not just look at one stream, such as becoming a politician or such as becoming an engineer, but we encourage people to design products, to be able to promote products on YouTube and social media and become also the kind of middlemen. So I think we can find many different channels of also promoting innovation without also being specific to one theme. Because I think our silo mentality also always urges us to kind of choose one distinct way. But I think innovation and creativity is not one channel, and it's also not a very traditional conservative past method. We need to also kind of adopt and also engage with the new kind of social media entrepreneurship perspective which has come up as well.
I want to focus on the innovation tech synergy. And I'm going to anecdotally tell you something. So obviously we know I've been a journalist with the BBC for many, many years. And because of that, I've traveled extensively across the African continent. But Kenya in particular struck me. They've got what they call the silicon savannah, so a lot of an ecosystem that supports tech developments in Kenya. But also 60-70% of the economy is agrarian, and in almost every backyard in Kenya, people are growing, they have an allotment or growing their vegetables for the family. And what young people have done in this particular instance is in those urban greenhouses, those backyards that are growing vegetables, they've put up canopies and inside a sprinkler system which is attached to an SMS line. And so you're out and about doing your shopping, but if the temperature in that greenhouse increases, you get an SMS, and then you're able to trigger the sprinkler from wherever you are in Nairobi. And those are just some fascinating innovations that respond to the environment in Kenya, specifically for Kenyan households. What kinds of innovations are South Africans coming up with that could be scaled up to market, but that would really help?
I think, for example, from UCT, there are students and Stellenbosch. I've heard of students who have designed programs and apps similar to that one, which have monitored water leaks in schools, and they implemented them in schools and in households in more kind of poorer areas. There's also people who have done that with electricity as well. So there's a cell phone app which notifies you of kind of electricity wastage. And there's people who design solar batteries as well, and school children are being taught also how to make their own solar batteries as well. So I think innovation in South Africa is also quite at it's increasing in scale. But I think, unfortunately, there's not that much of a platform to kind of invite people to present their ideas. And the funding as well is still a problem to kind of support people, because I think sometimes we wait for crises such as the day zero when we then fund people to kind of present their ideas. But on an everyday basis, there's so many young people, such as the batteries and the water apps. And for example, in Senegal as well, it's similar to that one, but it's related to air quality. There's a young person who designed an app which measures the air quality so that when the air is very polluted, people don't go outside or they wear masks. And this was way before the COVID time.
Morateja, I'd like to bring you into this conversation by way of perhaps some innovations that excite you, but also to this point where we need venture capital that finds these innovations and can help them scale up and roll them out into market. This is where the funding issue can be answered.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, what this conversation has reminded me of is one of the interlocutors that I speak to about my research was telling me about what she's doing while she's looking for work. I think there's a perception that young people who aren't employed are doing nothing and that they're just at home sitting, and that's not true. So she was looking into using kind of the tins that you get for like baked beans and so on to use in the farming. They've got some farmland where she lives at home in rural Limpopo.
Right.
And so I thought that was quite interesting, and that she's interested in, if it works, scaling it up and maybe being able to build a business from that. But the issue, and it was something that was recurring over and over again, was that she wasn't able to find the support to be able to do this, and definitely not the funding. So I think that's a critical issue, is not only are young people kind of brushed aside and not heard, but there actually isn't support. We hear about, oh, you should be an entrepreneur, and there are people who are interested in being kind of environmental entrepreneurs, but don't get the funding at all. So it's all just lip service.
You
But
concur.
what I also wanted to add,
Go ahead.
what I also
finish.
wanted to add, Lerato, to the list that you've provided about whether it's a financial, tech, or policy issues, is that those kind of, to me, sound very kind of technical approaches to how we could solve this and how we could innovate. But I think that at the heart of this issue, especially if we think about it globally, and that the fact that we're in South Africa, is that it's an issue as well about appropriation. If we think about the history of how rich countries got rich through colonialism and appropriation. So then it's not just a technological issue or a technical issue, but it's also an issue about justice and injustice,
Right.
and that needs moral and political response to it as well.
Fantastic. You had a view?
Just to add on that, there is an app that was developed at UCT, which is Abalone app. So they are helping fishermen, young fishermen.
Nice.
They can go to the app and they will know what's happening. The other issue, I hear we're talking about technology, but if you go to agriculture, the majority of people that are small-scale farmers are older people. So if you go to the Eastern Cape, the granny that doesn't have a cell phone to get notifications about the weather and things like that. But the great thing is we are seeing a transition of young people now entering that space, which makes it easy for us to then use certain technologies and innovations. However, at the very same point, we still have those old people that are working now. What do we do with them? What innovations can they do now to help them now?
So tech adoption for the older generation. I want to look at innovation in a different sense, in a financial sense, Ayaka. And here we've heard that there's $100 billion that's been pledged towards climate solutions in the African continent. But it's a pledge. For that money to be rolled out, there need to be bankable projects. So the money's sitting there in the ether, but Africans need to come up with the solutions that can go to market. What can some of those solutions be to incentivize those investments?
Ooh, that's a good one. And it's quite unfair when you say that as Africans, we have to prove that we deserve the money of the 100 billion, because historically speaking, people just came and they took our land, they took our resources. They didn't have to prove anything. And now that we deserve it back, we're told you have to prove. So that just for me is like, But definitely in terms of like what that 100 billion could be used to do is definitely accelerate the green economy in South Africa, accelerate that shift. What also can be done is like climate reparations. That's a conversation that's being had widely by young people, and not just climate reparations from the government, but from the top 100 polluting companies, corporates that are responsible for the climate crisis. And those are the conversations we need to be having. We can't be telling Africans, you have to prove that you're going to utilize this money correctly when you were able to come here, take our resources, take our land, take everything that you need. So there are those things that are put in place, universal basic income grants, innovations, untraditional ways of learning. We have to break away from the system that we are in, where you have to start at grade art and all you taught is basic learning skills. That's definitely not serving the purpose in society. And the conversations young people want to have are the deeper ones that have wounds that have to heal. So definitely we have to go back to the most critical conversations like climate reparations and just people really being held accountable.
Right. So climate reparations is a suggestion. You know, you want to mine the minerals, take it back, earn your profits. You need to come and assuage. You need to come and make things better through different investment programs. Other things are happening for the oceans, blue bonds. for agriculture and for energy, green bonds. Those are complex sort of financial services and products that are happening at a capital markets level. But are they adding to the solution, do you think?
I think they are, but I also think that we need to also kind of like look at it at a more kind of practical level, because I realized that we don't invest a lot in infrastructure, and we ignore the infrastructure which and the buildings which we've already had. And I think also urban and town planning plays a big role as well now that we've seen the climate crises happening in more kind of like our areas, our hometowns. And I think that's the kind of like the part which we need to kind of look at is how do we bridge the gap now between kind of like the broader idea of like planting back money and creating the Green Climate Fund towards making things change immediately. And what we can look at is infrastructure, piping, buildings, town planning, moving people from informal settlements to more kind of safe urban spaces as well.
To the point about infrastructure, I'll just read you these comments and perhaps you can respond and then we can move our conversation onwards. Lynn Hafner says, flooding of rivers in South Africa is due to litter, too much litter in the rivers. She also says no cleaning of rivers, plastic and litter, not enough canals, no cleaning of storm water drains by Joburg Water. True story. I've just written off a car because the water level rose during a summer storm. The earth is changing, so it's not just a climate issue. The earth is just changing. I don't know, the geographers at the table can help us with that. Jacques Pretoria says, although coal is a problem for South Africa's energy issue, cutting down forests to build new shopping malls, parking areas, offices and houses is also a huge problem. An insatiable appetite for accumulation in South Africa. Trees are supposed to remove carbon dioxide from the air and clean up the oxygen, yet few people plant trees. We're busy building shopping malls, but we're not planting trees. And this is, I think, to your point, where this is human-induced. What is the thing that needs to be done to conscientize all of us, and not just people who are interested in the subject, just for somebody to say, yes, I've waited a long time to build my dream home, build it, but plant trees in your garden. What do we do to change consciousness in that way?
I think, again, it goes back to education, awareness, critical conversations like we have now. So if we want to build a mall, there should be, not just in paper, a practical thing that they will do, such as planting trees, such as investing more in research of adaptations, mitigations, such as investing more in women in rural areas who are contributing like 80 to 90% in terms of our farming and agricultural productivity. So are they doing something, even though you're taking away from the environment, but are you also taking care of it at the same time?
When you take, put it back.
Yes.
All right, let's talk about this issue of, Muratega, I'd like to take the conversation forward. Let's talk about activism, because that's essentially what you are urging people to do. It's just to be aware of the fact that within your own small space, you can be a soldier for social justice, for climate justice, for the just transition. How you raise your children, how you recycle things in your home. It's almost a way of living in countries like Germany, for instance. You know, people have like 3 or 4 dustbin bags in Switzerland, purely so that you can do that. Ayaka, I want to bring you into the conversation now and ask you how we engender the spirit of civic awareness, activism, people not wearing their blinkers. Let's start there.
I believe everyone should be an activist, especially in the African context. We all have the obligation to be activists. We have so many socioeconomic injustices happening and we just can't afford to do nothing about it. But in order for people to become activists, they have to develop a consciousness about the cause and they have to relate it to themselves. That's why we speak about intersectionality being so important, understanding that people are facing a lot of socioeconomic injustices and you first have to understand their situation before you imply that they have to care about climate change. So when it comes to being an activist, I don't like it when people say, no, I don't think I'm an activist, because we all have the duty to be an activist. And as young people, it's becoming very clear that we can't just say, okay, we put the hope in the older generation. We have to step up now. And it's becoming younger and younger kids stepping up and speaking in global forums. There's Yolam Kokwana, a young activist she's in grade 8 now. She started in activism in grade 6 and she's gone to major African continents speaking on this cause.
Countries, yeah.
Yeah, countries, sorry. So speaking on this cause, so it's becoming very apparent that young people are feeling the stress and the burden at much younger ages, and we're trying to step up and reach that gap. That's why I actually appreciate NGOs and NPOs that supply us with resources and information and show us how to use our voices and educate us. So corporate businesses have to also invest in NGOs, NPOs that have a specific focus on socioeconomic injustices, especially climate change.
I'd like you to clarify or help us understand the terms climate justice and the just transition. And as Murategi said, this is the morality here.
So for me, climate justice, I remember when we were having the conversation yesterday, climate justice is not just about the climate. It's social justice, it's environmental justice, it's economic justice. So that's firstly what we have to identify, that we can't solve all of these problems in silos. We have to solve them interconnectedly. So that's my definition of climate justice. It's not just an environmental issue, it's social, it's political, it's economic. So we have to solve it as such. And when it comes to a just transition doesn't just mean moving away from fossil fuel intensive industry and going to renewable energy. It means making sure that everyone that's going to be impacted by that just transition also gets justice, and they are compensated and they are taken care of. They're reskilled into the appropriate markets.
Murategi, I know you've got something to say. Let's bring you into the conversation, but I'd like you to add to your intervention this issue of rehauling or thinking about a post-capital era, this subject matter that you broached earlier on, that the only way we're going to integrate more South Africans into the economy, we're going to create jobs for younger people, and we're going to embrace a corporate climate consciousness is to completely redefine what capitalism looks like here.
Yes, I think that is the case. I mean, going back to the comment that was made about, well, there's a focus on fossil fuels, but at the same time, we're cutting down trees to build malls and to build offices for kind of what is, frankly, in the current capitalist economy, bullshit jobs, according to David Baker.
Manure.
Yes, so we really do have this kind of obsession with consuming and growing, but to what end? And I think if we think about what it takes to kind of keep growing and growing and growing year after year and consuming at the rate that we are, that it's not compatible with the goals that we want to achieve to be under 1.5 degrees Celsius and emitting zero carbon emissions by 2050. So I think that's something that we have to take quite seriously. And I don't know how well it will sit with a lot of us, because I mean, we're all participating in the capitalist economy. So individually, I think it'll take a lot for us to kind of move away from it and think differently. And then the last thing I'll add is on the kind of the activism spaces. I think one of the ways to mobilize people is to, in the same way that we say that governments think in silos, I think maybe we do as well, in that we have so many social causes. And I think one of the ways that it might be more effective is to link people up. In that, I think climate activism should be linked up with the struggles of the working class. And I also think that they should be linked up with anti-imperialist struggles in the global south. And I guess I have a question for Ayaka, who I think is more kind of active in the activism space, so to speak, about what extent, Ayaka, do you think that environmental movements have been able to integrate other struggles into their movements as well?
At actually a major extent, I remember when we were at the global climate protest last year, and we had people from Black consciousness movements supporting us online. We had people from other social injustice movements like the LGBTQI plus community standing with us. So it shows that all around the world, we are understanding that we have to fight together and we have to support each other and we have to stand in solidarity. We don't have to go there and be obvious that, no, I'm representing the LGBT community. We just have to come together and understand that this is the cause, so we all need to collectively come together and support that. And that's been very evident in young people in the past in terms of protesting, going out, raising awareness. We always are bringing up this idea of intersectionality and understanding that we can't fight these injustices in silos.
I want to refer you to something that's happening in America. America's my reference for everything today. I should put on an accent. Yeah. Okay, so Democrats in Washington, the Democratic caucus, are tabling a motion for the Congress, for the government of President Joe Biden to consider a civilian climate corps. And basically what they're saying is roll out federal taxes for programs that will lead to jobs in this particular area of climate and environmentalism, where young people can be brought out of universities to do on-the-job training and be placed into corporates where their income or their internships can be subsidized so that you have this cross-pollination of skills. It's a small measure, but it is one of those things that is being put forward as a solution to jobs, to raising awareness, and to doing something about environmentalism in a corporate sphere. How can South African corporates and the South African government think about the issues that have been raised here today in a creative way, a solution-oriented way?
I think for me, we need to start holding industries and big companies accountable. So the funding can also still come from them because they also absorb the youth population into the employment sector. But I think we tend to speak about activism and we put so much pressure on the individual. People have been already doing a lot of initiatives and sustainable fashion, personal, recycling and the bins you spoke about earlier. But I think now we need to start calling out the industries and the companies. As the question or the statement you read out earlier mentioned the litter problem. We need to start calling out on the big companies which are producing the non-recyclable plastic and other different products on how can they also make an initiative from their raw materials and manufacturing processes, which will also contribute to that. And then that's how then we can start incorporating young people who are already studying these skills in varsity and are aware and educated, that they can start now working in the industry and advising in the industry, and not always just being seen as the small middleman who's doing the more kind of low work. But young people are quite intellectual. They can also advise, and they can also be involved in the critical discussions of how to shape and redesign the structure of the industries.
So this is value chain stuff, and I think what I'm asking as well is the social compact, where it's not silos, it's not business, you do this, government, you do this, we're young people, and this is what we're going to do. But somehow people come together in the spirit of solidarity to say, we all believe this, we all want to change. We're not fighting, we can work together. How do we build that consensus?
Just to add on that point, it's not about just the policy on its own. It's not about the government working on its own. It's not about the young women in the rural area working on their own. I think it has to be, we have to speak to each other. It has to be an integration across different spheres so that we can come up with solutions that are practical for us in that sense. So I think it's a matter of making sure that in the room, you don't just have a CEO talking to the managers alone, but we need to have people that are on the ground facing these challenges all the time. And surprisingly, they have solutions as well that they're applying. So are we integrating our indigenous knowledge in these solutions that we're coming up with? Do we have people in the room to make sure that they are applying this, and what exactly are the issues that they're facing? We read a lot, we're making reference now to the American society, but do we really know what's happening in our own backyard?
South African society. And that's where this activism issue comes in. There was a comment that came in from Millen-Z Edition, long comment, but perhaps we can tackle it before we close up. An event that really got me intrigued in relation to climate change was the COVID-19 period, meaning from January 2020 is his reference. Is it a coincidence that the world, especially Africa and Europe, received more rains during this period? If there is any relation between the two, would you say that the reason the first world is dragging their feet when it comes to implementing actions to mitigating climate change is that they have a plan up their sleeves that they will unleash should it get to a stage it affects us all severely? There's a lot going on in Menzi's question. I think the first one is people know what to do, but they won't do anything unless there's a profit motive behind it. I think that's the insinuation. And then the second one is why we've seen so much rain. If I tell you what my mother said, she said, God is weeping, God is disappointed. I'm not preaching, but I don't know, how do people rationalize the weather patterns, this rain?
That's actually very common. It's very interesting. I remember when I started to be an activist and I was telling my mom about climate change. She was so resilient and telling me, no, it's okay. It's God. It's something we did as people that are indigenous. And that's the knowledge that's out there, that if something wrong is happening, it's because of God. And we really need to break away from that narrative that, no, God did it. And we have to start putting accountability on the table, but not just the word, the suggestion. We have to see it. As you said at the beginning, transparency is important, and we need corporates, we need your investors to start that chain of transparency. We need to see what your motives are as Sanlam to make sure that people are educated enough and have the resources and have the data to know that I have to move away from fossil fuel now and invest in the renewable energy sector. So it's coming to a point where people can't be resilient anymore. We really have to get to the nitty-gritty and hold people accountable, but not just the word that is being thrown around. Right. We need to see it happening.
And Morategi, in terms of the solution might already be there, but until people can see it in pounds and dollar signs, nobody's going to talk about it until they find a market for it.
That's the issue. I think that's the problem with the way that we've structured our economy, to kind of focus on capital accumulation and profits and kind of appeasing rich people, is that unless kind of the solutions speak to making even more money, that no one is in fact listening. And I think it is interesting. I mean, I don't know that people in rich countries have something up their sleeve. I think maybe it's just a case of people being a little bit cavalier about the impact of climate change. Also, it's older people who probably won't be here to feel the effects, so they could kind of be like, well, it doesn't really matter. But I do think that there is kind of an implicit acknowledgement that Africans are going to be feeling it a lot more. So there was a clip that went viral of that woman in Germany who was crying and saying, well, you expect things like this to be happening in Africa, but not here. And that's people who are very much aware that the impact's going to be worse. So maybe they're just biding their time that, you know, it'll happen, but it won't happen to us.
Yeah, I remember that clip. There's horrible, horrible floods in the north of Germany. All right, we're ready to wrap up our conversation. We've touched on many issues, from the need to dismantle capitalism as we know it, to social justice and its morality, to reparations. Reparations are not just pledges. We've spoken about innovation. We've spoken about social solidarity movements and intersectionality. We have said, stop putting a Band-Aid over a bullet wound. So a lot has been said here. But what is the thought you would like people to walk away with foremost of mind? If they don't remember anything, this is what they must remember. Morategi.
I think I'd like to leave people with a question to think about what a sustainable economy looks like and what's the place of business and investment in that economy, and to think really carefully about, you know, centering humanness and human well-being and human needs.
Akona?
I think for myself is that the COVID pandemic was a dress rehearsal for what the climate crisis will be. And if we didn't learn the lessons that we had to during the COVID crisis, the bounce back won't be as easy, especially with infrastructure, financing, and social support for people when the climate crisis hits. So I think it's time now to start implementing measures which will help us in the long run.
Ayaka?
We can't eat money. We can't drink oil. That's all I'm going to say. After all has been done and all has happened, the borders are not going to protect you from the climate crisis. And when you're left with the money, remember, we can't eat it, and the oil that you're investing in, we can't drink it. It goes down to the principle of being human and the needs we need.
Lulega?
For me, I think it's the issue of integration. The least we can do right now is just to come together. It's not a climate issue. It's not an environmental issue, but it's an issue that is affecting all of us, whether you're rich or you're poor. But the major problem is the poor are the ones that are going to feel it the most. So we have to talk to each other, and we have to put these talks into action, into solutions, practical solutions that are going to help us in our own spaces.
Just before I wrap up, Anonymous asks, should the Department of Education, Basic Education, not add 10 minutes per day to the syllabus to educate school children on topics of environmental and ethical practice?
That would be amazing.
That would be great.
That would be amazing.
And again, it's also not the application of just the environment. How does that affect the economy? How does that affect the social part of things? So it's not just learning about the environment, but how all these three different spheres interact with each other.
I think the 10 minutes matter, but I think it's about reintegrating it into the syllabus. Changing the textbooks, changing the curriculum would be more sustainable than maybe a 10-minute introduction, maybe once a week or every day.
Yeah, it's a good start, though. I definitely have to say that it's a good start.
And what is the question about South Africa. I've just lost it here. But global warming results in climate change. Climate change is the main cause of unprecedented and erratic weather patterns. The end result is a disaster. Disasters are the disruptions of the normal functioning. I think what concerns me, and this is me personally, is that it's all good and well to have conversations and to point out the problems and to locate the problems into the future. It's disconcerting when the basic premise is that the only thing that awaits humanity is disaster. Because those old people you've referred to are people who in themselves face their own traumas, whether it's war or apartheid, and where they are at, however wrongly they may have behaved, it's in response to what were pressing issues of their era. And so when somebody says, I achieved democracy, it's because it was a priority then, in as much as climate justice is a priority of the future. But we can't behave as though people have just been resting on their laurels, accumulating, building houses, doing nothing. Each generation is faced with its own precipice, its Rubicon moment, and they've confronted that. Maybe this is yours, but this has been a build-up.
I agree. I think it is a build-up. I think we are in a generation that's well-spoken, but at the same time, we're not just facing these climate crises. We're not just having infrastructure problems, flooding, not being able to move from one end to the other. On top of all these things that are happening, we have social injustices. We have unemployment that we have to think about. We have a whole lot of socio-economic issues. But the truth of the matter is those issues will be exacerbated by the climate that we're facing at the moment, and we have to do something about it. The literature is there, the scientific evidence is there. It's pointing out that the Southern African region will feel these impacts much more compared to the others. At the same time, we don't have a lot of resources to actually adapt to these changes. So that's why we have to invest in things that are practical for us.
And just like on that point, I feel like that's why the conversation of Millen-Z and the borders that we're implying are so crucial. We need to take that border away, that this is the crisis of the Gen Z. We need to take that away completely, because we're still facing trauma and psychological effects of things that happened in the past when we were not even born.
To your parents and to your grandparents.
Exactly.
Yes.
So it's a perpetuated cycle, and we have to stop putting borders in place and saying that, no, this is Gen Z, this is your time to shine, you have to make the change, because that's not going to help us. We need everyone to unite and stand together and understand that I have a role to play.
Leato, I just want to add that we acknowledge what the older generation has gone through. And I think what they can just do is now allow space for younger people and innovative and willing people to also come in and contribute. And I'd like to refer people to the movie Don't Look Up, if they've watched it on Netflix. That movie kind of contextualizes the statement you just made, which is, if the older generation doesn't understand and doesn't kind of realize the sense of urgency, they must make room for scientists and people who are already kind of like aware and activists in the space to have room to contribute. It's not taking away from them and their trauma and their generational, challenges, but it's acknowledging and making room and space for the people who find the existential crisis of climate change very pressing and very urgent.
Muratir, you've just seen me showing my age here a short while ago, just feeling like I need to bat for the other side, really. This is not fair. And your response is?
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of try not to feel kind of a doomsday approach, because I think that can be overwhelming and I think it can be paralyzing in some respect. So I really try to be optimistic. I think that we can achieve kind of a goal of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius. I just don't think that we can achieve it in the current economic system that we have. But I think that, we just have to do the work, and we just have to get on with it. But staying optimistic.
And of course, our focus has been South Africa. What is the one thing that can be done in South Africa to effect change right now, to start getting that ball rolling?
Oh, how long do we have? I mean, I think there's a question of political will. That's something very difficult to talk about in South Africa. I think especially recently, in terms of what's been happening in the political climate, and I mean politics with a big P. So accountable leadership, and also just, I mean, taking young people more seriously in leadership positions as well. And I'm inspired by something like the Not Too Young to Run campaign in Nigeria, because I mean, like, gerontocratic leadership is a problem all over the world, but especially more so in Africa. So I think if we could start there, I would start to feel really hopeful about the future changing.
Just to add on that, we're already at 2 degrees higher. It's not even a 1.5 because we're in South Africa. So it's even above that. I think altogether what we can do is just create more awareness. Let's continue with awareness, but also putting those awareness and those talks into action. We need to see young people in those spaces, in the government, in the policies, in the corporate world. All those things need to speak to each other, and we need to really start actioning things out.
Team SA?
There's a lot to be done, definitely. And as my co-panelists have said quite beautifully, that we have to start at young people, and we have to start at awareness, and we have to make sure that we give young people the space to lead. But it's not only about putting young people in a position or like putting us in the room or putting us at the table. We have to make sure that we have the resources to actively participate in those discussions. Because what often happens is that we get the opportunity to be part of these panel discussions, but then we don't contribute because the jargon is so vast. So it's definitely starts with that awareness and allowing young people to be actively participating in these spaces.
There's a young boy on the video wall there in that picture. He just looks like he's judging us.
I think I want to emphasize the role of the media. I think our media is not putting our personally South African stories out there. The media and the weather services aren't educating us about the drastic effects which will come with the climate disasters, which will impact us. So I think I want to also put more kind of like effort on people like you, Lerato, when you are on your, I'm sorry to reference you and call you out, but I think when people who are media personalities are speaking about social issues, they need to kind of also kind of reintegrate the environmental crisis. So if you're looking at people who are affected by flood, it's very important to then also make reference to the climate crisis, which brought about the effects of that flood.
Okay, so we're breaking down solutions now in terms of activism, what South Africa can do. Let's go back to the money and the money bags, because, you know, it's a tricky one. There's so many different financial models. There's what you can do in the capital markets, stock exchange, bonds that I've referred to, private equity, pension funds. Then there's what governments can do by way of grants and what we're seeing the Democrats proposing in the US Congress. Then there's how you can invest in entrepreneurs and apps. There's so many elements that can be done. Then there can be what parents do, the pocket money you give your kids and what the school decides are charitable causes. There's so many ways to skin this cat. Where do we just get people saying, yeah, let's put our money where our mouths are? Reparations. Let me not forget the reparations you mentioned.
Yeah, that's very crucial. But also, we really need to start taking the pressure off of the individual to make a difference, and really start hammering down on the fact that 100 of the most emitting companies are the ones that are responsible for about 70% of global emissions. And we really need to start speaking about that. We really need to start taking the pressure off of the individual, because as people, we can do anything. We can start plowing, we can recycle, we can say no to single-use plastic, but the reality is that we don't have enough time. So the things that we can make that create impact right now is holding people accountable. And people need to realize that the power is in the people, the power is in the working class. So we need to start education and awareness there.
Funding?
I will add to that. In terms of funding, there are some funding that's out there. There's the Green Fund. There is the World Bank that's investing on these things. I think it's more of targeting what we actually need in South Africa. So are we investing in just renewable energy? But if we're doing that, are we also investing in education so that the kids in Mpumalanga now know that we need to think differently about the type of work that we want to engage in? There's also an issue of women and children. Are we really investing in the marginalized communities, whereby we have women that contribute vastly? They're already marginalized, but then these effects are even exacerbating that. So are we investing in the right type of systems?
I think we need to hold corporates accountable when it comes to corporate tax that we already have in South Africa, and climate tax, because I think we're already kind of get the money from climate tax, but then we know with corruption and other, manipulative systems in South Africa, the money never gets to the person who needs it the most. So I think the bridge must be, kind of the gap must be bridged together so that the company which does pay a corporate tax or climate tax also for pollutions and emissions, the money must go to the trees, the money must go to funding the education system, the after-school program, the money must reach the people which need it, because we are good at designing policies. We're known for having one of the best constitutions in the world. But I think, like, for example, our climate tax and the climate change bill, those must kind of reach the people at grassroots. The money which is raised from the climate tax must actually make a change in our communities.
Yeah, and you do have those taxation when you buy a car, the emissions tax. It's already there. So it's a question of you want to see it.
Yeah.
What is it doing? And for you, Moratehi?
I mean, on the point of the emissions tax, I don't know whether that's enough, because then I guess it sends a message that if you're rich enough, then you're allowed to pollute the environment. And I think that's not where we want to be. But I guess to add to, like you said, there's so much financing options. To add to that, there are things that maybe aren't kind of climate change specific, but I think that will help, are kind of a redistribution of incomes, so that's more fairly redistributed. People have suggested wealth taxes. People have suggested capping wealth in countries so that no one's pretty much about 40% of the national income in their wealth and in their earnings and so on. And I think those can play a really important role as well. And in terms of kind of international financing, I think there's kind of a lot of thinking that has to go around the form that it takes, whether it's in the form of grants or loans, and the power dynamics involved in that. I think particularly if we cast our minds back to structural adjustment era and the very kind of negative consequences that came from that.
Moratehi, are people allowed to have fun after this? I mean, shucks. I'm thinking of a story of how Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world at the moment, has bought himself the super yacht. It's a bit controversial how he's done it. The shipping yard is in Rotterdam. In order to get it out of the shipping yard, they're going to have to dismantle the Erasmus Bridge in Rotterdam. But this is a person who perhaps is paying a lot of tax. He's a major employer in the United States through Amazon, and then paying corporate tax at a company level, and then runs a philanthropic organization, and so giving back in those. So 3 dimensions of giving. And the moment somebody says, I just want to have a little bit of fun, we judge them. Is this the world we're living in now?
I mean, no, people are allowed to have fun, but I think how we define fun will probably have to change. I think, I mean, in the point of philanthropy and aid, I'm very critical of that, because I think people think that people create their money and their wealth in a vacuum. Yeah. But the point is that we're all relational human beings, and that people who are able to amass as much wealth as the wealthiest people in the world often do so through exploitation of the working class and the poorest in society. And so I think it's unfair to say, well, I've made this money and now I can have fun, when there are people who are equally kind of suffering on the same earth. So maybe let's I think this is an opportunity for Africans in particular to rethink development, to rethink modernity, and to rethink fun.
I think that's a poignant place to leave it. I want to thank you all. Luleka Dlamini, a PhD candidate, Moratehi Kale, a PhD candidate as well, Akona Qocheni, a youth advocate, and Akaya Melitafa, a climate justice. Ayaka Melitafa, a climate justice activist representing the African Climate Alliance. It's been really a stimulating conversation, enlightening, thought-provoking. We've also gone through many questions that the delegates have asked us, and it's complex. But I think one thing I've learned today is that climate change is not just something we talk about in environmental and geographic terms. There is that important word we learned today, anthropogenic. It's man-made, and when it's man-made, the responsibility to fix it has to be man-made, female-made solutions. We've also heard that the solutions can be locally generated, so African solutions to African problems. We can learn best practice from the West, but we adapt it to the local conditions. So thinking global, acting local. And then ultimately, the innovations are needed in funding, the innovations are needed in policy, but the greatest innovation will be bringing everybody to the table, because your problem is my problem. That's what you mean by intersectionality. There's nothing happening in a silo. And if the floods in Johannesburg affect you, then believe me, the weather patterns changing in rural KwaZulu-Natal will then affect the next person. And if we adopt that consciousness, so much is going to change. We've been discussing Millen-Z, climate justice for social impact. It's been Critical Conversations brought to you by Sanlam Investments. Please ensure that you join us for our next edition, where our focus is going to be on public-private partnerships. That's going to be taking place on the 13th of May. Look out for the notifications. This year's Critical Conversations has a particular focus on South Africa and sustainability in this country of ours. Let's be part of the solution. So make sure that you join us when we discuss public-private partnerships in May. Again, tune in. You will be earning your CPD points. And also, let's remind you to engage via social media. It's hashtag Critical Conversations, tag at Sanlam Investments. This has been Millennials, Millen-Z, and Climate for Social Sake. I'm Lerato Mbele. It's always great being here. Thank you very much to Sanlam Investments. Until next time, do it confidently, do it conscientiously, be the solution.